Let me come to you immediately, Karin, since you are the author of this very important report. Were you surprised by the findings, especially with regard to Africa?
Well, not overly surprised. Last year, Africa had registered significant improvements, but this year we did find a slight decline in the overall level of press freedom on the continent. And this occurred for several reasons. One of the main causes in Africa was the sort of reaction to what was going on north in the Middle East and North Africa, and the reaction to the Arab Spring uprisings. Predictably, news of those uprisings was censored in several of the more restrictive environments in Africa, such as in Zimbabwe and Ethiopia. In several other countries, I think governments were worried about sort of a follow-on effect from what was happening with the Arab Spring. And so when journalists were trying to cover anti-government protests in those countries, they faced increased pressure. And instances of that occurred in 2011 in Angola, in Malawi, and in Uganda. So we did see a slight decline overall in Africa last year, but it was not wholly unexpected.
If I may ask, what kind of criteria or methodology did you use in order to arrive at your current rankings?
Well, the Press Freedom Survey has been conducted since 1980, and we have a methodology that we use to apply to every single country in the world. So every country is judged according to the same criteria. And what we really try to do is look at the entire enabling environment for media freedom. And we have a set of methodology questions which is divided into three basic categories. We look at the legal environment for press freedom, we look at the political environment, and we look at the economic environment. And based on the answers to those questions, we assign each country a numerical score, and then the rating of free, partly free, and not free.
How long did this report take you to compile?
Well, usually it's probably about 4 or 5 months. We have a set of analysts who are responsible for, doing the research, drafting the reports, and also drafting the scoring. And then we have a set of meetings where we bring together analysts, we have advisors, regional advisors, and also Freedom House staff, and we arrive at the rankings together. So some of our writers are based in countries in Africa, some are based in the US. This year we also had the participation from some of the press freedom groups that are based in Africa, so that was a really valuable addition to our input this year in terms of determining the scores.
Did you personally visit some of these countries?
Yes, I was in South Africa last year, and as you know, South Africa is sort of one of the main countries on the continent, and a lot of the other governments, I think, look up to it as being a model for media freedom as well as for democracy in general. And there have been some worrying developments in South Africa over the last year or two, both with the introduction of the Protection of Information Bill as well as some other negative developments. And Freedom House is hoping actually to go to South Africa again this year to do a follow-up mission. But I was in South Africa last year at the Highway Africa conference and was able to meet and interact with journalists from all over the continent at that conference. So that was a very valuable experience for me.
Let's talk briefly about the champion from Africa, and that is the Republic of Mali.
Mm-hmm.
Are you concerned about, for example,
well, Mali is actually... I mean, last year it was ranked the best country in Africa in our ratings, and it's held that position for a number of years. And so this is, we're quite worried actually with what's happened in 2012, which is not accounted for in our rankings, which cover 2011. But the recent coup in Mali and the troublesome developments there really are raising a question about what's going to happen with media freedom. We already saw a number of violations around the time of the coup, and it's entirely possible that Mali will slip from the #1 rated country in Africa in our next edition of the index.
Karin, I was looking at the Global Index report, and I was surprised, and I'm always really surprised, especially with regards to Singapore. Singapore is in fact tied with Angola and Qatar for 150th place, and is considered to be not free. Can you explain a little bit about that, Singapore?
Well, Singapore is an interesting example because although it does very well in terms of a number of social and economic indicators, the government in general and also the media environment is considerably more restrictive. the ruling party does, exercise control either through ownership or other means over a large number of the media outlets in Singapore. And as a result, many journalists practice self-censorship, as well as, being subject to some censorship. There are also very strong provisions for libel in Singapore, and so journalists who write news articles or anything else that may anger the government can be subject to crippling defamation lawsuits. And several journalists, have been put in jail. So the restrictive environment in Singapore is a result of mostly the legal environment as well as the control by the ruling party over most of the media there.
What about Qatar, of course, the home of Al Jazeera? Qatar.
Mm-hmm. Well, Qatar is another interesting example because it's relatively free with regard to, if you look at other countries in the Middle East. And as you mentioned, Al Jazeera is one of the main outlets which has been, I would say, instrumental in bringing more press freedom to the Middle East as a whole. But Al Jazeera, interestingly, very often does not cover with critical analysis the Qatari government. They are very critical and provide more robust analysis of other countries, but they tend to self-censor a bit with regards to Qatar itself. And if you look at the whole environment in Qatar, not just Al Jazeera, it is fairly restrictive in terms of both the legal environment as well as the ownership of media outlets as well. So similarly to other countries in the Gulf region, there's a very high level of self-censorship by journalists in Qatar as well.
What problem do they have, really? This is a very small, very, very rich country. A country of about, I guess last time I checked, about 1.2 million people, and 700,000 happen to be foreigners. Every Qatari is supposed to be pretty much well off.
Yes, I think they are in terms of economic indicators, but similarly to other countries in the Gulf region, they are ruled by a monarchical royal family, by a sultan, and they they have very limited levels of general freedom in general, and as well as press freedom. So it's a different model of politics than what you get elsewhere in the world.
Would it be fair to say that if you were perhaps measuring service delivery, that both Singapore and Qatar would probably be world champions?
Yes, definitely. I would say both of those countries do quite well in terms of issues of service delivery. But when you look at issues of both general political freedom as well as freedom of expression and media freedom, they do much worse. And I think some would argue that there may be a trade-off between the two, but I think it's not necessarily the case. There's no automatic correlation between the two.
Would you say, would you agree with some who would say that service delivery and democracy may be mutually exclusive?
I don't say that that's necessarily the case. You see in a number of countries, both poor and rich, that there is some service delivery in very free countries. Definitely when you look at countries in the North America, in Western Europe, in parts of the Caribbean and the Pacific, you do see service delivery in very free countries. So I don't necessarily think that there is an automatic correlation between the two. Both of those countries, Qatar and Singapore, are helped by the fact that they're also very small countries. They're as you said, very small populations, very small landmass. So in those countries as well, it is much easier to have service deliveries than in a country which is very big geographically or which has a very large population as well. So those two countries, I think, are very particular in terms of their geographical, size and the population.